The year is 1977. Manhattan, New York City. It is past midnight on a quiet street in Woodside, Queens. A man steps out of his apartment building. He has done it 1,000 times before. He breathes in the cold night air, and for a moment, everything seems normal. But tonight is different. Tonight, someone is watching him from the shadows. Someone he used to trust. Someone who once called him the boss. A car rolls up slowly. No headlights. No noise. Just the sound of tires on asphalt. Then, gunshots. The man's name is Mickey Spillane. He is the reigning king of Hell's Kitchen, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the history of New York City. He has survived wars, betrayals, and the wrath of the Italian Mafia for years. But tonight, Mickey Spillane does not survive. And the man who ordered his death, he's not from the Italian Mafia. He's not some powerful crime lord with an army at his back. He's a stocky, cold-eyed Irish kid from the same streets Mickey Spillane once ruled. His name is James Coonan. He's 30 years old. And he is just getting started. Because what James Coonan is about to build in Hell's Kitchen is something so brutal, so savage, so utterly terrifying, that even the most powerful mafia bosses in New York City will be afraid to say his name out loud. The FBI will one day call him responsible for up to 100 murders. Federal prosecutor Rudy Giuliani will call them, and these are his exact words: the most savage organization in the long history of New York City crime. And the Italian Mafia? The men who ran organized crime in America for decades? They had one simple word for the Westies: crazy. Stay with me, because this story is going to take you somewhere you have never been before. Before we go deeper into this story, I want to stop for just 1 second. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where the Syndicate Files family is tuned in from tonight. And what time is it where you are? And if you love true crime stories like this one, hit that subscribe button right now so you do not miss the next video. We go deep into the most dangerous, most forgotten, most unbelievable crime stories from history. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves true crime. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to this channel. Now, let us go back to Hell's Kitchen. To understand the Westies, you first have to understand Hell's Kitchen. Because this neighborhood did not just produce criminals. It produced a specific kind of criminal, raw, fearless, and completely unafraid of death. And that is because, for generations, death was simply a part of daily life in Hell's Kitchen. Hell's Kitchen sits on the west side of Manhattan. It runs from 34th Street to 59th Street, from 8th Avenue all the way to the Hudson River. Today, if you walk through that area, you will see luxury condominiums, upscale restaurants, rooftop bars, and well-dressed people walking dogs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It looks like any other trendy Manhattan neighborhood, but underneath all of that polished glass and expensive brick, the ground is soaked in blood. The name Hell's Kitchen first appeared in print on September 22, 1881, when a New York Times reporter followed a police guide into the West 30s to cover a multiple murder. He described a particular tenement on 39th Street and 10th Avenue as Hell's Kitchen, and said the entire area was, in his words, probably the lowest and filthiest in the city. The name stuck. And for the next 100 years, it lived up to it every single day. The neighborhood was built on immigration and poverty. After the American Civil War ended in 1865, hundreds of thousands of people flooded into New York City looking for a new life. Many of them were Irish, fleeing the destruction left behind by the Great Famine back in Ireland. They came with nothing. They had no money, no connections, and no safety net. They crammed into overcrowded tenement buildings where entire families shared single rooms. They worked on the docks along the Hudson River, on railroad lines cutting through the city, in dangerous tanneries and slaughterhouses. The work was brutal. The pay was almost nothing, and the living conditions were some of the worst in the entire country. And when people have nothing and the system offers them nothing, some of them turn to the one thing that seems to work. They turn to each other. They form gangs. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, Hell's Kitchen was crawling with gangs. The Hell's Kitchen Gang, the Gorillas, the Parlor Mob, the Gophers, led at one point by the legendary Oni Madden, who would go on to become one of the most powerful bootleggers in Prohibition-era New York. These gangs were not sophisticated criminal operations. They were collections of young men from the same streets, the same buildings, the same families, who banded together for survival, money, and respect. Violence was not just a tool, it was a language. The only language that seemed to matter in a place where the government had already decided that poor Irish immigrants were on their own. By the mid-20th century, Hell's Kitchen had not improved much. The neighborhood was still overcrowded, still depressed, still left behind while the rest of Manhattan kept growing richer and more powerful around it. The Port Authority bus terminal, which opened in 1950, carved up land right in the heart of Hell's Kitchen and turned parts of the neighborhood into a hub for street crime. Pickpockets, robbers, drug dealers, and prostitutes operating openly on the surrounding blocks. The honest working people of Hell's Kitchen were caught in the middle. They went to church. The Sacred Heart of Jesus Catholic Church was where gang families worshipped side by side with regular neighborhood families. They went to work. They raised their children. And they tried to stay out of the way of the men who controlled the streets. Those men, by the early 1960s, were led by a single figure, a man named Mickey Spillane. Not the famous crime novelist, a different Mickey Spillane entirely. This Mickey Spillane was an Irish-American mobster with something unusual for a Hell's Kitchen gangster. He had style. He had brains. He understood politics. Spillane ran the rackets in Hell's Kitchen with a certain level of discipline. He controlled bookmaking, illegal gambling on horse races and sports. He ran loan sharking operations, lending money at crushing interest rates to desperate people who had nowhere else to go. He controlled union jobs at major New York institutions: Madison Square Garden, the New York Coliseum, the docks along the Hudson River. Workers who wanted jobs at these places needed to go through Spillane, and Spillane made sure they all knew it. His political connections were just as powerful as his criminal ones. He married Maureen McManus, the daughter of the McManus family, a dynasty that had run the Midtown Democratic Club since 1905. That connection gave Spillane access to politicians, city officials, and construction contracts. He was not just a street thug. He was a power broker. And for most of the 1960s and into the 1970s, he kept the Italian Mafia, specifically the Genovese crime family, led by Fat Tony Salerno, out of Hell's Kitchen. Even though the Italians had vastly more money and members, Spillane held his ground. Hell's Kitchen was Irish, and it was going to stay that way. But there was a problem, a very serious problem, and his name was Jimmy Coonan. James Michael Coonan was born on December 21st, 1946 in Hell's Kitchen. His father was an accountant who ran a tax office on West 50th Street, which puts into perspective just how much of a choice Jimmy Coonan made when he decided to walk into organized crime. This was not a young man who had no options. This was a young man who chose the streets deliberately, early, and completely. By his teenage years, Coonan was already building a reputation as someone you did not want to cross. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall, stocky and broad-shouldered, with the build of a street fighter and the temperament to match. He dropped out of school at 17, and almost immediately, he set his sights on something that most people in Hell's Kitchen would have considered insane: taking down Mickey Spillane. The conflict started personally. When Coonan was around 18 years old, Spillane had his father kidnapped and physically beaten. That single act lit a fire in Jimmy Coonan that would never go out. In 1966, The 18-year-old Coonan climbed to the roof of a Hell's Kitchen tenement building and opened fire with a machine gun at Spillane and his associates on the street below. He did not hit anyone, but the message was clear. Spillane responded the way powerful men do when they feel threatened by someone beneath them. He went to Coonan's father, slapped him around, and told him to get his son under control. Then he had Jimmy arrested. Coonan was briefly imprisoned on charges that were eventually pleaded down to manslaughter. When he got out, he did not slow down. He organized. He recruited. He built around him a crew of young Irish men from the neighborhood, men who were angry, violent, and ready for war. Among those men was someone who would become Coonan's most important ally, a young, blonde-haired, baby-faced Vietnam War veteran who had joined the military at just 17 years old by lying about his age. He had served with the Special Forces. He had seen things in Vietnam that had changed him in ways he could never fully explain. He came home to Hell's Kitchen in the early 1970s, and the streets did not help him heal. They made him worse. His name was Francis Mickey Featherstone, and the people of Hell's Kitchen, the ones who knew him, who saw him in the bars and on the corners, they crossed the street when they saw him coming, not because of how he looked. He looked like someone's younger brother, but because of what he was capable of. Featherstone had already killed men in neighborhood bars in front of witnesses multiple times and walked away without a conviction. Juries would not convict him. Witnesses would not testify against him. Because everyone in Hell's Kitchen understood that testifying against Mickey Featherstone was a death sentence. When Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Featherstone joined forces, something genuinely dangerous was born. Not just another street gang. Something that would grow into one of the most feared criminal organizations in the history of New York City. But to take power, they first had to go through Mickey Spillane, and they were not going to do it quietly. By the mid-1970s, Hell's Kitchen was changing. Mickey Spillane could feel it. The younger men in the neighborhood, the ones who had come back from Vietnam broken and furious, the ones who had grown up, watching their fathers get nothing despite years of working the docks and the union halls. They were not interested in the old way of doing things. They did not want discipline. They did not want political connections and handshakes behind closed doors. They wanted money, power, and blood. And Jimmy Coonan was ready to give it to them. The war for Hell's Kitchen did not start with one dramatic event. It started slowly, like water wearing down stone. Coonan and his growing crew began targeting Spillane's people, the men who collected his money, who enforced his debts, who kept his operation running. Any resident of Hell's Kitchen who openly supported Spillane was subject to beatings, kidnappings, store vandalism, and robberies. Those who sided with Coonan were left alone. It was a calculated campaign of terror designed to isolate Spillane and make him look weak. On August 20th, 1976, one of the most significant moments in the entire power struggle took place at the Sunbright Bar on West 46th Street. Eddie Comiskey, Spillane's main enforcer, one of the toughest men on the West Side, was shot and killed inside the bar. With his most feared muscle gone, Spillane's hold on Hell's Kitchen began to collapse rapidly. He moved his family out of the neighborhood, retreating to Woodside, Queens. But leaving the neighborhood was an admission of weakness. And in organized crime, weakness is an invitation. Coonan moved quickly to consolidate power. He was not just violent, he was strategic. He had been working as an enforcer for a well-connected loan shark named Ruby Stein. Stein was a Jewish money man who financed loan sharking operations for both the Irish mob and the Italian Genovese crime family, working directly with Fat Tony Solano. Stein had money flowing through him from multiple criminal organizations. And Coonan, along with several of his crew members, owed Stein significant amounts of money. The solution Coonan arrived at was as simple as it was horrifying. In May 1977, Coonan lured Ruby Stein to the 596 Club, a bar on West 43rd Street, that served as one of the Westies' primary gathering places. Once Stein was inside, Coonan and several members of his crew shot him dead. But killing Stein was only the beginning. What they did next sent a message that echoed throughout the New York underworld for years. They dismembered his body, they cut him into pieces, and they threw what was left of him into the Hudson River. This was not just murder. This was a statement. The Westies were telling every other criminal organization in New York City that they operated by different rules. There were no rules. There were no limits. No one was safe. And if you crossed them, you would not simply die. You would disappear. But one piece of Stein did not disappear. In a detail that became darkly legendary in organized crime circles, one of the Westies forgot to deflate the lungs before dumping the torso. The trapped air caused the body section to float. It washed up on shore a few days later and was discovered. The police knew immediately what they were dealing with. But knowing it and proving it were two very different things. By the time of Stein's murder, Coonan had made contact with someone who would change the entire trajectory of the Westies. His name was Roy DeMeo, a Gambino, crime family soldier who was already one of the most prolific killers in the history of American organized crime, responsible for dozens of murders carried out for the Gambino family. DeMeo and Coonan recognized something in each other. They were both men who used extreme violence as a business tool, and they could do business together. In August 1977, the final act of the power struggle was carried out. Mickey Spillane stepped out of his apartment in Woodside, Queens. Roy DeMeo, acting as a favorite at Jimmy Coonan, was waiting. Spillane was shot multiple times and killed on the street. Just like that, the old order in Hell's Kitchen was gone. Jimmy Coonan was now the undisputed boss. And the gang he led, the one that would become known throughout New York as the Westies, was ready to begin its most violent and most profitable years. The alliance with the Gambino family was formalized under the reign of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. The arrangement was straightforward. The Westies would serve as an enforcement arm for the Gambinos, carrying out contract killings and muscle work on the West Side. In exchange, the Gambinos would finance the Westies' loan sharking operation and allow them to use the Gambino name and reputation as added protection. The Westies paid the Gambino family 10% of the proceeds from their various criminal operations. It was a partnership that made both sides more powerful, but it was also a partnership built on mutual distrust and barely contained violence. The Gambino men viewed the Westies the way a person views a guard dog that might turn on its owner at any moment, useful but dangerous. The Westies, for their part, valued the relationship for the money and protection it provided, but had no intention of truly answering to anyone. Meanwhile, Mickey Featherstone was establishing his own terrifying reputation as the second most dangerous man in Hell's Kitchen. Despite his blonde hair, blue eyes, and baby face, Featherstone was a man whose capacity for violence seemed to have no bottom. He had been found not guilty by reason of insanity after one killing. He had beaten multiple murder charges because witnesses were simply too afraid to testify. He drank heavily. He had a hair-trigger temper that turned explosive in an instant. And he was completely loyal to Coonan, at least for now. The Westies operated out of a handful of Hell's Kitchen bars. The 596 Club was one. The Sunbright Bar was another. These were not glamorous locations. They were dark, working-class Irish bars where men drank whiskey and talked business in low voices. Nobody who was not supposed to be in those rooms ever walked into them. And the people who did walk in uninvited tended not to walk out. The Westies' criminal operations were diverse. Loan sharking was the foundation, lending money to desperate people at interest rates so high that most borrowers could never pay them off, which meant they were permanently indebted to the gang. Numbers running, illegal bookmaking on sports and horse races. Drug trafficking, which became increasingly significant as cocaine flooded New York City in the late 1970s. Extortion, businesses in hells, Kitchen paid the Westies for the privilege of staying open without being robbed or burned to the ground. And then there was the union racketeering. This was where the Westies made serious money, the kind of money that built real power. They controlled union positions at some of New York's most prominent institutions. At Madison Square Garden, one of the most famous arenas in the world, at the New York Coliseum, at the West Side docks through the International Longshoremen's Association. Getting a union job in any of these places meant going through the Westies. And the Westies extracted tribute from every single paycheck. In January 1978, Coonan and Featherstone committed another murder that illustrated exactly how the Westies handled debt. A loan-sharking customer named Richard Tassiello had fallen behind in his payments. The Westies killed him. And then, following the pattern they had established with Ruby Stein, they dismembered his body. Dismemberment was not random savagery, or at least not only random savagery. It served a practical purpose. A dismembered body is much harder to identify. It generates far less usable forensic evidence. And the act itself was so disturbing that it made even seasoned law enforcement officers deeply uneasy. Prosecutors struggled to bring cases forward. Witnesses vanished or refused to cooperate. The NYPD, Organized Crime Squad, and the FBI both tracked the Westies closely throughout this period. By their estimates, the gang was responsible for somewhere between 60 and 100 murders between 1968 and 1986. For a gang that at its peak never had more than 12 to 20 active members at any given time, that number is staggering. These were not a large army. They were a small, intensely violent crew that operated through pure terror. Rudy Giuliani, who would later become the mayor of New York City, but at this time was a federal prosecutor, was building a case against the Westies that he knew would be one of the most important prosecutions of his career. But bringing it together was extraordinarily difficult. The witnesses who could testify were either dead, in hiding, or too frightened to speak. That was about to change. But not in the way anyone expected. Because the person who would eventually destroy the Westies was not a detective. He was not a federal agent. He was not a rival gang member. He was sitting right at the center of the operation, drinking whiskey at the 596 Club, with a baby face and a Vietnam War tattoo on his forearm. The early 1980s in New York City looked like the end of the world. Times Square was an open-air market for drugs and crime. The subway was covered in graffiti, plagued by violence, and avoided after dark by anyone with sense. Buildings in the Bronx were burning, deliberately, for insurance money, while the city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Cocaine was everywhere. Crack cocaine was beginning to filter into the poorest neighborhoods, and the violence that followed it was unlike anything the city had seen before. Hell's Kitchen was no exception. If anything, it was a concentrated version of everything wrong with New York in that era. The sleaze of Times Square had pushed westward into the neighborhood's bars and back streets. Drug money changed hands openly. And at the center of it all, Jimmy Coonan's Westies were making more money and committing more violence than ever before. But power at that level always comes with complications. And by the early 1980s, the Westies were navigating a set of complications that would eventually doom them. The first complication was the Gambino family. After the death of Roy Damio in 1983, Damio was killed by the Gambinos themselves, who feared he had become a liability. Coonan's main contact with the Gambino organization shifted to a capo named Daniel Marino. And by the mid-1980s, when John Gotti murdered Gambino boss Paul Castellano in front of Spark Steak House in December 1985, and seized control of the family, Gotti appointed a man named Joe Watts as the official liaison to the Westies. Gotti used the Westies the same way Castellano had, as a contract killing squad, available for hire when the Gambinos needed work done on the West Side without getting their own hands dirty. From the Gambino perspective, the arrangement was ideal. They got violence on demand from men who were too unpredictable to be afraid of doing it. From the Westies' perspective, the arrangement was more complicated. Some members were uncomfortable with how deep the Italian connection ran. They were Irish gangsters, proud of it, rooted in Hell's Kitchen and its working-class Irish identity. Answering to the Gambinos, even informally, felt like a betrayal of something. Mickey Featherstone, in particular, was uncomfortable with the direction things were heading. He had signed up to be part of an Irish mob. He had not signed up to be a hired assassin for the Italians. Meanwhile, both Coonan and Featherstone had rotated in and out of prison throughout this period. In 1979, Coonan was convicted on weapons charges and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Featherstone was convicted in 1982 of using counterfeit currency at a massage parlor, caught because the woman at the establishment remembered the tattoo of his name on his forearm. He was sentenced to 6 years and served time in a psychiatric unit at a federal medical center in Springfield, Missouri. Here's the thing about the Westies. They were so deeply embedded in Hell's Kitchen that even with both their top leaders in prison at the same time, the operation kept running. Edna Coonan, Jimmy's wife, took over the day-to-day management of the loan sharking operation while her husband was locked up. She collected money from the gang's middle-level loan sharks. She relayed messages from Jimmy inside prison to men on the street. In 1983, she passed along a message from her imprisoned husband to Mickey Featherstone, ordering Featherstone to kill someone who had stolen loan sharking money. She also authorized another gang member to be, in her words, put out of the loan sharking business or for the others to do whatever you guys want with him. She was later convicted on racketeering charges that included her involvement in murder. She received 15 years. During this same period, the Westies pulled off one of their most audacious and bizarre schemes, one that showed exactly how creative their criminal operation had become. When the USS Intrepid, the famous World War II aircraft carrier, was converted into the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum, and opened on the Manhattan waterfront in August 1982, the Westies moved in almost immediately. Through their control of ILA Local 1909, the union that staffed the museum, they placed members in union positions throughout the institution. Sissy Featherstone, Mickey's wife, worked there as a ticket seller. She and several other women ran a scheme where they saved previously sold tickets, resold them, and kept the money. Meanwhile, union members in no-show jobs collected paychecks without ever setting foot in the building. The Westies siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from a war memorial museum dedicated to American veterans. The scheme only unraveled when the museum filed for bankruptcy in July 1985. And financial investigators discovered the skimming during the bankruptcy proceedings. It was that kind of audacity, that complete absence of limits or conscience, that made the Westies so uniquely dangerous. They would steal from anywhere and anyone. They would kill for almost any reason. And they were extraordinarily difficult to prosecute because the people who witnessed their crimes were paralyzed by fear. There is a specific story that illustrates just how terrified the neighborhood was. In 1979, Coonan and Featherstone were put on trial together for the murder of a bartender named Harold Whitehead. Two key things happened during that trial. One witness killed himself before he could testify, and another simply refused to take the stand despite the consequences. Coonan and Featherstone were both acquitted. The message sent to every potential witness in Hell's Kitchen was clear and permanent. Testifying against the Westies will cost you everything. By the mid-1980s, the Westies were operating at a level of criminal sophistication that was far beyond what most people imagined a small Irish street gang could achieve. Their loan sharking network extended throughout the West Side and beyond. Their union connections gave them access to no-show jobs and skimming operations at some of New York's most prestigious venues. Their contract killing arrangement with the Gambinos gave them a steady stream of income from hits. And their reputation for dismembering bodies kept potential witnesses silent and kept rivals from moving against them. But inside the organization, things were beginning to fracture. Mickey Featherstone was not the same man who had walked into the Westies in the early 1970s. He was still dangerous. He was still feared. But years of violence, prison time, psychiatric treatment, and a growing discomfort with the direction the gang was heading had changed something in him. He had a wife, Sissy, and children. He was beginning to think about what his life actually looked like. And he was deeply unhappy with Jimmy Coonan. The relationship between the two men had become increasingly tense. Featherstone believed the Westies had lost their identity, that Coonan's obsession with the Gambino connection was turning them into something they were never supposed to be. He also believed, correctly, as it would turn out, that Coonan no longer fully trusted him. In 1985, a man named Michael Holley was shot and killed on the streets of Hell's Kitchen. The shooter was Billy Boken, another Westie. But Boken carried out the murder wearing a disguise. He was wearing a wig. He was dressed to look like Mickey Featherstone. When Mickey Featherstone was arrested for the murder of Michael Holley in April 1985, he was genuinely shocked. He had not committed this crime. He had not been present. He had no involvement. He was being set up, and he knew exactly who had authorized it. He was convicted in March 1986 and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Sitting in his cell, staring at 25 years for a murder he did not commit, Mickey Featherstone made a decision. And that decision was going to burn everything down. He picked up the phone. He called the prosecutor's office. And he said 3 words that no one in Hell's Kitchen ever said. "I will talk." When Mickey Featherstone decided to become an informant, he did not do it out of remorse. He did not do it because he had found religion or suddenly developed a conscience about the dozens of murders, beatings, extortions, and acts of terror he had participated in over the previous 15 years. He did it because he felt betrayed. He did it because Jimmy Coonan, the man he had stood beside through a decade and a half of bloodshed, had authorized a frame job that could have buried him for 25 years for something he did not do. In the world of organized crime, loyalty is the only currency that truly matters. And Jimmy Coonan had spent Mickey Featherstone's loyalty like it was nothing. Now Featherstone was going to collect the debt, with interest. The operation to bring down the Westies began quietly, with Featherstone providing information to prosecutors about the gang structure, its members, and its operations. But information alone was not enough. They needed evidence. And getting evidence from inside one of the most paranoid criminal organizations in New York was going to require something extraordinary. Sissy Featherstone, Mickey's wife, the woman who had sold stolen tickets at the Intrepid Museum, the woman who had been embedded in the Westies operations for years, agreed to cooperate. She began recording conversations with gang members while wearing a wire. Sitting across the table from men she had known for years, men who trusted her completely, she captured them on tape talking about the murder of Michael Holley. She recorded Billy Boken describing the shooting, confirming that he was the one who had dressed as Mickey Featherstone and pulled the trigger. In September 1986, Judge Alvin Schlesinger reviewed the new evidence. He overturned Mickey Featherstone's conviction. Featherstone walked out of prison a free man. And then he walked directly into a meeting with federal prosecutors. At the same time, federal prosecutor Rudolph Giuliani was assembling what would become the most devastating legal weapon ever used against the Westies, a RICO indictment. RICO stands for the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was a federal law specifically designed to prosecute organized crime enterprises as a whole, rather than going after individual crimes one at a time. Under RICO, the government did not have to prove that Jimmy Coonan personally pulled the trigger on every murder. They only had to prove that Coonan ran a criminal enterprise, and that the enterprise engaged in a pattern of criminal activity. With Mickey Featherstone on the inside, willing to testify to everything he had witnessed and participated in over 15 years, the RICO case against the Westies became one of the strongest organized crime prosecutions in New York history. Giuliani announced the RICO indictment in early 1987. The charges covered criminal activities going back 20 years: murder, loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking, union racketeering, contract killing on behalf of the Gambino crime family. The full scope of what the Westies had been doing, laid out in black and white in a federal indictment, was staggering, even to people who had been tracking the gang for years. The trial began in September 1987. For 4 weeks, Mickey Featherstone sat in the witness box and testified in open court about the inner workings of the Westies. He described murders he had witnessed and participated in. He described the dismemberment of Ruby Stein in 1977. He described the contracts carried out for the Gambino family. He described the internal structure of the gang, the way decisions were made, the way violence was authorized and carried out. He was a devastating witness, not because he was polished or articulate or especially compelling in the way television lawyers sometimes are. He was devastating because he was specific. He knew names, dates, locations, and details that only someone who was truly inside could have known. The defense had no answer for him. On February 24, 1988, the verdicts came in. 8 of the Westies' core members were convicted of racketeering and related offenses under RICO. The courtroom was quiet as the sentences were handed down. James Coonan, the man who had built the Westies from nothing, who had murdered his way to the top of Hell's Kitchen, who had made the Italian Mafia nervous, was sentenced to 75 years in prison. The judge specifically recommended that parole be denied. James McElroy, one of the Westies' most feared enforcers, received 60 years. Richard Muggsy Ritter, convicted of loan sharking and drug-related charges, received 40 years. Edna Coonan, Jimmy's wife, was convicted and sentenced to 15 years. Billy Boken, the man who had dressed as Mickey Featherstone to commit the murder that ultimately triggered the entire collapse, was convicted of racketeering. Mickey Featherstone himself pleaded guilty to a single racketeering charge. Due to his extraordinary cooperation with the government, Judge Robert W. Sweet sentenced him to 5 years of probation. No prison time. He was released in December 1988 and immediately entered the Federal Witness Protection Program along with Sissy and their children. They disappeared from Hell's Kitchen forever. Where they are now, nobody outside the program knows. James Coonan is currently imprisoned at the Federal Correctional Institution in Schuylkill, Pennsylvania. His full-term release date is listed as November 17, 2061. He would be 114 years old. In a February 2023 parole hearing, Coonan, elderly, in poor health, having lost all of his teeth in prison and suffering from partial deafness, obesity, high blood pressure, and a form of skin cancer, asked to be considered for release. As of this writing, he remains behind bars. The fall of the Westies did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most criminal empires fall, from the inside. Through betrayal, through paranoia, through the simple fact that when you build your entire operation on fear and violence, eventually that same fear and violence turns back on you. After the convictions, the demographic that had sustained the Westies for generations began to disappear from Hell's Kitchen entirely. Gentrification, which had been slowly transforming Manhattan since the early 1980s, accelerated rapidly in the late 1980s and through the 1990s. The old working-class Irish tenements were converted into condominiums. The dive bars became wine bars and farm-to-table restaurants. The people who had grown up on those streets, the families who had known the Westies by name, who had paid them tribute and stayed silent out of fear, they were priced out and pushed out of the neighborhood they had lived in for generations. Hell's Kitchen was reborn as something unrecognizable, and the streets that had once produced the most violent street gang in the history of New York City became just another expensive corner of Manhattan. But here's what you need to sit with for a moment. At the height of their power, The Westies were never more than 12 to 20 active members at any given time. That is it, a group that could fit in a single bar, many of them related or childhood friends, responsible for somewhere between 60 and 100 murders over roughly 2 decades. They controlled unions at Madison Square Garden. They stole from a war museum dedicated to American veterans. They served as hired killers for the most powerful Mafia family in New York, and they terrified an entire neighborhood into silence for a generation. They were not powerful because they had numbers. They were not powerful because they had sophisticated infrastructure or endless money. They were powerful because of one thing, and one thing only: fear. And when Mickey Featherstone, the man who had helped build that fear, brick by bloody brick, decided that the fear no longer served him, the whole thing came down in less than 2 years. There is a lesson in that. There always is. The walk-up tenements on the streets of Hell's Kitchen still stand today, many of them converted to luxury apartments. People who live there now have no idea what happened in the basements and back rooms of those buildings. They do not know whose blood is in the walls. They do not know the names of the men who ruled those streets with knives and guns and pure animal terror. But now you do. And that is the true story of the Westies, the deadliest gang Hell's Kitchen ever produced. A group of Irishmen from the most forgotten streets in Manhattan who made the entire New York underworld afraid to say their names. Think about this for a second. James Coonan is still alive right now, sitting in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. He has been locked up since 1988. The neighborhood that created him, the world that made him who he was, does not exist anymore. The tenements are condos. The dive bars are tapas restaurants. The docks where the Longshoremen's Union once ran its rackets are now luxury waterfront development. Hell's Kitchen is gone. But the story of what happened there will never be gone. And here's the question that should keep you up tonight. Mickey Featherstone, the man who committed multiple murders, who served as the enforcer for one of the most brutal criminal gangs in American history, walked out of court in 1988 with 5 years of probation. He's out there right now, living somewhere under a name you do not know, with a face that may look nothing like what you imagine. He was never punished for the things he actually did. Think about that. Now, if this video had you locked in from start to finish, do me one favor. Hit subscribe right now, because we go this deep on every single video on the Syndicate files. Every day, we bring you the real stories, the ones the textbooks skip, the ones the news barely covered, the ones where the truth is stranger and darker and more unbelievable than any fiction. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves true crime, because a story this good should not be kept to yourself. The Syndicate Files. The truth is always more dangerous than the story.